Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and well, let's just jump right into it. This tiny green dot you see right here, that's essentially the first ever potential candidate for the existence of Planet 9, the hypothetical 9th planet located somewhere in the solar system. But because there is so much more to the story, and because this is not actually even that certain just yet, I wanted to discuss this in more detail, starting with the study itself and the single scientist who was able to discover all of this, Michael Rowan Robinson, whose study as always you can find in the description below. And so let's talk a little bit more about what exactly he did compared to some of the other scientists and why he was able to find this one candidate while no one else could. And also discuss the possibility of this actually being that planet we're looking for, or if it's just another object that's going to be identified as something entirely different. And let's begin with the Planet 9 itself. So by now you're probably familiar with the story already, but just to give you a brief overview, a few years ago several scientists started to discover the distant objects that we often refer to as TNOs, also known as trans-Neptunian objects. Around this time, this is when Pluto was officially demoted from being a planet to being what's known as a dwarf planet. And so quite a lot of these objects started to be discovered, and a few of them seem to possess very unusual orbits with very specific inclinations that would be difficult to explain unless something was pulling at them from a somewhat distant region in the solar system. Mostly because they were far enough not to be affected by anything including Neptune, and so these unusual orbits were kind of difficult to explain at first. And because of the relative similarity of their tilt, several scientists independently proposed that maybe there's actually some sort of a hidden object, such as the 9th planet. And maybe this particular planet is pulling at these objects just enough to create these visible changes in their orbit. But this was based on the observation of just a few of these objects. Since then, in the last 6 or 7 years, a lot more of these TNOs have been discovered, and some of the orbits did not actually match anything. As a matter of fact, several other explanations have been proposed, including the potential gravitational effects from pretty much the entire region that we refer to as the Oort cloud, and the potential scientific bias when it comes to observing these specific TNOs. As a matter of fact, one of the best explanations was described in one of the videos before, and that was basically that maybe we're just biased at when we're looking for these objects and where exactly we're finding them. In other words, the existence of Planet 9 started to be kind of questioned. And so many scientists were still quite divided about its existence. On the one hand, we expect there to be some sort of another planet based on the simulations of the formation of the solar system, but on the other hand, well, some of the previous surveys, specifically infrared surveys, did not really discover anything. Or at least anything big and warm enough. A smaller object could still exist somewhere, but we're just probably not seeing it. And there was even an eccentric proposition that maybe all of these observations are caused by some sort of a primordial black hole that's just invisible to us. Now that was an explanation that was sort of far-fetched, but it was scientifically valid in the sense that we know that primordial black holes can definitely exist, and assuming that something is gravitationally pulling at these objects, well, maybe it's a black hole. And so there were definitely a lot of different propositions to try to explain all of these unusual observations in the orbital parameters. And so assuming that such a planet does exist, well, where would it be located and what sort of a planet would it be? Well, the initial proposition was that it was anywhere between 5 and 10 masses of planet Earth, and it was probably about 400 to 800 astronomical units away from the Sun. So basically it would be a Neptune-like world, very cold Neptune-like world, and it would be really far, way past the orbit of Pluto. But because nothing was really being detected with these particular parameters, the scientists had to rework some of their initial assumptions. The most recent assumption is that, well, it's probably about half as far, maybe between about 380 and 460 AU. And the mass of the planet could also be a little bit smaller, possibly 5 masses of planet Earth, or even less. But the two major infrared surveys that are usually really good at detecting these objects, or even detecting small comets, and so here we're talking about the WISE survey and the Pan-STARRS, did not discover anything in any of their data. Or to be more exact, they ruled out anything that's size of Neptune or in that vicinity. So nothing that would be about 8 to 10 masses of planet Earth seems to exist anywhere in the solar system except for, of course, inner solar system. Although the thing is, these surveys did not cover the entire night skies. Some of the other patches had to be covered by some other telescopes. One such telescope is the 8-meter Subaru telescope located in Hawaii. But once again, as of to date, nothing was discovered by any of these telescopes. And without an actual visual observation of Planet 9, its existence is, well, it's very hypothetical, and it's basically just an assumption, a big assumption. As a matter of fact, making the announcement so quickly about this planet unfortunately gave science a little bit of a bad credibility, at least in my opinion. Nevertheless, it did kickstart a tremendous search of the night skies, which allowed the scientists in the last few years to discover a lot of super cool things we've discussed on the channel already. Now, there is actually one telescope that everyone's looking forward to, the Vera Rubin telescope, that's definitively going to be able to search the entire night skies and identify every single hidden object in there. But that telescope is still a few years away from being operational and from being able to conduct such a search. Okay, but then how exactly did this person discover something? Well, he did something entirely different, something really smart. He looked at an extremely old data from one of the first surveys, infrared surveys, of the entire night skies. Or basically the granddaddy of all infrared surveys, IRAS, Infrared Astronomical Satellite. And this was a survey conducted nearly 40 years ago, 1983. It lasted for just under 1 year, but collected quite a lot of data. And what's really cool about this telescope is that, well, it seemed to have been extremely good at detecting a lot of infrared things that at first made no sense to anyone. For example, during its operation, it detected several sources of infrared radiation coming from several stars. But when the scientists used Hubble telescope or a lot of more powerful telescopes to look at those stars, they found nothing. So initially, this was assumed to be some sort of a mistake and possibly just something wrong with the telescope. Turns out it was seeing something. It was actually detecting infrared signatures from various protoplanetary disks, and this was not discovered until 2014 using some of the most powerful telescopes out there. So it was basically detecting this, and it was doing so 30 years before it was officially discovered by, for example, Spitzer telescope and modern version of the Hubble telescope. It then also discovered some other mysterious infrared signatures, which in the beginning did not make any sense. Later on, the scientists realized that what they were looking at is this, the so-called infrared cirrus, or these galactic filaments that basically form these very large infrared clouds and that seem to be present in many regions of the galaxy. And some other infrared points turned out to be very distant galaxies, something that was also not seen by any previous telescopes until then. Although interestingly, back in the days, back in 1983, one of the biggest headlines was actually in regards to a potential detection of some kind of an object in the solar system. Maybe a planet, maybe something else. But this is really important because it turned out to be not in a solar system at all. Because it's kind of difficult to measure distances in space, this turned out to be extremely far away and was actually once again one of these cirrus clouds. And so there was at least one case when it was basically a mistaken identity. But nevertheless, this telescope was able to discover over 250,000 different objects in the night skies, and many of them have not really been classified even today. And so for this particular study, Michael Rowan Robinson decided to go with the survey, decided to use the data from here, and specifically focused on trying to figure out what would hypothetical Planet 9 look like if it were to appear in this survey. In other words, what sort of a point would it represent? Would it be a large point? Would it have certain other parameters? And well, by making this assumption, he decided to go through the entire survey and see if he can actually discover anything that matches these particular observations, with the planet itself very likely just being a single dot somewhere in the survey itself. But a dot that would be unidentified and that would be probably traveling in a somewhat eccentric orbit. Now, pretty much most of the objects in the survey are either asteroids, galaxies, or different cirrus clouds. So for the most part, all of the points he discovered suggested that it was something that was already known or something that was not a planet at all. But this was under the assumption that the planet would be slightly larger, anywhere from maybe 5 to 10 masses of planet Earth, and that it would be 400 to 800 AU away from the Sun. And with these particular parameters, nothing was discovered in these regions of the solar system. This is of course including the entire night skies. But what if we lower the mass of the potential Planet 9 and move it a little bit closer to the Sun? So here, something that's maybe less than 5 masses of planet Earth, at a total distance of anywhere from 200 to 400 AU. Now first of all, at this point, the object would be slightly larger. It would be maybe 2 or even 3 points. And because this object would be moving across the night skies, it would also have a specific separation between the first detection and the last detection. And using these parameters, several hundred different points have been identified in the survey, but the majority once again were not really planets, but once again were either galaxies, different clouds, or a lot of different comets and asteroids. Except for this one point right here. There was one single candidate that seemed to fit right into the description of what the scientist was looking for. And here the distance would be about 225 AU, and the total mass of this object would be anywhere from 3 to 5 masses of planet Earth. But remember, super preliminary discovery. There's a really high chance that this is actually something entirely different. And this is exactly what the scientist concludes his paper with. But I guess the question is, why was it not seen before? And how exactly can we prove this object and its existence? Well, the main reason it was not seen in previous surveys is because of its relatively high location in the night skies. As in, it has a relatively high ecliptic latitude, while at the same time having a low galactic latitude. And many of the previous surveys just didn't really look in this region. The author also admits that because the telescope is relatively old and this is basically one of the first technologies using this, the data here is not of the highest quality, so additional observations are needed to see if this is really there. He also provides the overall orbital calculations, suggesting where we can possibly detect it today. While at the same time, additional observations using other frequencies is also needed to see what's happening here. For example, using radio telescopes, using optical telescopes, and using a lot of other observations to determine exactly what this object is and what exactly was discovered in the survey. So for example, if it's discovered that this is a stationary object and it hasn't moved at all in the last, like 38 years? Well, this would mean that it's not an object in the solar system at all. It's probably once again some sort of a distant infrared object that created an unusually similar appearance to a planet in the solar system. However, if this object moved across the night skies as predicted here, and if it's also detected by some of the other surveys, for example optical telescopes or radio telescopes, well then we're onto something for sure. Which means that, well, we now need to wait for follow-ups, for additional observations, and the potentially groundbreaking news about maybe discovering a new planet in the solar system. But until this is either confirmed or denied, once again, an extremely preliminary discovery. An exciting discovery, but still very preliminary. Something that we're going to explore in some of the future videos once this is either confirmed or explained in some other way. Either way though, it's going to be a really exciting explanation. So until then, thank you for watching, check out all of the relevant links in the description below, subscribe if you still haven't, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, and maybe come back tomorrow to learn something else. Maybe support this channel on Patreon by joining the channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.